Dr. Bredesen, I'm going to start with you here. I know, I listened to your grand rounds at the Cleveland Clinic the other day. That was awesome, super interesting. You talk about there being different types of Alzheimer's, and I'd love to just jump into that because we're talking about individualized medicine. What are the different types of Alzheimer's, and how do you treat those different types differently?
So we just saw a beautiful example of looking carefully at many different metabolic parameters, and what we find is that if you actually look at people who have cognitive decline, be it full-blown Alzheimer's, pre-Alzheimer's, which is mild cognitive impairment, or pre-MCI, which is SCI, subjective cognitive impairment, what you see is that these people actually very clearly fall into different groups. And so we published this a few months ago and called this type 1, type 2, type 3, and then now there's all of type 4 and 5. And you can see, if you look at why organisms actually make amyloid, and you see Alzheimer's really as a change in a plasticity balance. Organisms make amyloid for three reasons. They make it because there is ongoing inflammation or infection, and of course amyloid is quite a good antimicrobial and an endogenous antibiofilm that binds metals and kills microbes. They also make it because of trophic factor withdrawal. So if you withdraw NGF or BDNF or estradiol, on and on and on, many supportive factors, the response is a downsizing that is led by the production of amyloid. And the third thing is that amyloid is quite good at binding a number of toxins, starting with divalent metals like mercury, copper, but also things like mycotoxins. So organisms make amyloids for different reasons, and we find that when you look at these more extensive profiles than are typically being done in doctors' offices, when dementia is being evaluated, you can see who is actually a type 1 or a type 2. Are people making this because of an inflammatory process? Interestingly, one of the common ones we call glycotoxic, which is actually type 1.5. These are people who typically have high hemoglobin A1Cs, high insulin resistance, that sort of thing. And it's because they have a combination of type 1. They have the inflammatory part from the advanced glycation end products, but they also have the atrophic part, which is from the insulin resistance. So insulin is a critical factor to support neuronal survival. So you can then look at these and treat them better. It turns out that you have to treat them differently. And specifically, type 3 is very different than the others because these people typically do have exposure to things like mycotoxins, high mercury, things like that, and you need to get at that instead of just giving them a drug for Alzheimer's disease.
That's super interesting. Doctor, maybe you could pass the mic to Dr. Palanisamy here. Doc, you're involved, everyone here is basically involved in completely individualized medicine, which is really exciting. Why paleo and why Vedic types within paleo?
Yeah, thanks, James. So I think for me, customizing a diet and lifestyle program is really the foundation of my practice. And Ayurveda and functional medicine, I think, share a lot in common. Some say that Ayurveda is the original functional medicine because, looking at the root cause and believing that all disease starts in the gut. So in terms of a paleo diet, I think removing all the foods that are inflammatory and really focusing on nutrient-dense healing foods, fermented foods. I've seen so many advantages with that in my patients, but they often have a challenge really figuring out what's the optimal diet for them. And that's where Ayurveda has been really helpful because it believes that every person has a unique body type from birth, and based on that, there's different dietary recommendations that go along with that. So it just helps taking paleo to the next level in terms of really personalizing it. You can tell someone to try and eat what's best for you and what's optimal, but most people need more advice and guidance for that, and that's where I found Ayurveda to be really helpful. So I think there's a real synergy between the two.
Doc, Doc, can I just stay here because one of the things that you guys are doing here at IGBOs is really democratizing access to personalized medicine by making that easy. And Steph's case was awesome there, right? All the regular labs show everything's normal, and then you go a little bit deeper into the other labs. Why have you sort of given up being a cardiologist to make IGBO, to take this role with IGBO? And what do you think the potential is with IGBO to create personalized medicine for everyone?
Fantastic. So I actually haven't given up practicing yet. I'm trying to evolve into the digital doc, and my heart's really been, no pun intended, in really early detection and prevention. And so using labs are really critical, along with listening, to really diagnosing diseases before they're even diseases, to change behavior, not necessarily starting medication. So the passion that really fueled this was that access to all this great science was really hampered by our ineffective blood logistics system that we have now, which is conventional phlebotomy. So if you think about it, there are over 3,000 specialty labs. We've got the reference labs out there. But how do these specialty labs get access to you guys and vice versa? And so as a science, you know, James, you mentioned the convergence. I call it a super convergence where, you know, you've got technology, you've got mobile. Everyone has an iPhone. More people have phones, smartphones, and probably access to bathrooms or water. You've got connectivity, you've got data analytics, and then on the science side, you have this amazing transformation occurring where the costs of doing certain kind of lab tests, genetics, are exponentially going down. So you get this super convergence occurring where the time is just right to disrupt our blood logistics system, because all of you guys, I'm sure the experience of ordering lab tests for your patients can be challenging. You give them a lab slip, James said 60 to 70% of the time they get it, they get the blood work done, but then what about those that don't get it? How do you know that they haven't gotten it done? And for me, it's a daily chore to try to understand that, because 70 to 80% of your medical decisions are often driven by a drop of blood, along with the history taking and everything else that you do. So we really sought out to try to disrupt this part of the healthcare system where we could democratize access by creating a platform. And so Uber paved the path for us ahead of time, creating that on-demand type of service. And we thought, what if we could create that for providers, create an on-demand blood delivery system so that when you order a lab, any kind of lab, that our Iggies could go get that lab work, whether it's in the office, like now, or it's, you know, tomorrow or next week or 3 months from now at work or at home or wherever the patient is. So on demand, anytime, anywhere, conveniently, and in a compliant type of way. Because remember, we want to make sure that they get the blood drawn. So that was really the basis of the fundamental reason we started this.
So you could like book someone now and then book someone again in like a month and 3 months, depending on when you need them to be drawn again?
Exactly. So you can create packages, right? So if you have certain panels, if it's diabetes and you need to monitor A1C or what other, you can do it every 3 months and again and again and again. And the other, you know, vision that we have is creating playlists for our providers so that they can tap into this great science and say, listen, I can create a panel for this symptom. I'm feeling tired. I have a fatigue package, you know, the hair loss package, or disease packages. So if you think about Apple Music or Spotify, you start to think about what the possibilities are that IGBO can clearly curate all this great science and then provide that decision support at a stroke of a pen or at a click of a mouse for you guys.
You're making my job harder because I've already got you pegged as the Uber for phlebotomists. You can't be the Spotify for phlebotomists too. Dr. Bredesen, you know, what's really cool with the Functional Forum is that it's Tuesday lunchtime in Australia and people are watching and sending in questions. So welcome everyone who it's Tuesday. Dr. Bredesen, someone has asked from Australia, they watch your grand rounds as well, and they were asking what your thoughts were about Alzheimer's in the context of this evolutionary medicine that we've been talking about today. Is there any understanding of Alzheimer's in that context?
Absolutely. I think in multiple ways to think about evolutionary medicine. One of the things we just published recently was a new insight into what ApoE actually does. And as you know, some people have called ApoE the God gene because it was involved with our evolution. It was involved with our coming down out of the trees, becoming hominids from simians. And it turns out to have effects, as we've heard, for carrying lipid, for binding to multiple receptors. Now, if you've just seen, actually, it just came out in Cell. It's also turning out to be important for invasion and metastasis of tumors, and of course, cardiovascular disease, and of course, it's the most important genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And what we found is that it actually is, surprisingly, a transcription factor. So it actually enters the nucleus. We found that it binds to the promoters of 1,700 different genes, and it literally changes the programmatics of the cell, changing, again, a little bit like what we heard about with thyroid. So you're changing from a state in which sirtuin, SIRT1 is dominant, in which it's a metabolic state and it is a non-inflammatory state. more toward an NF-kappa B dominated state. And these two are actually mutually antagonistic. So you're now changing the state of the cell toward more of an NF-kappa B-like cell. And of course, so part of our getting Alzheimer's disease, it's such a common problem now, and if you look at the 318 million Americans, 45 million of us will get this during our lifetimes if we don't do something about it. You're really talking, for many people, about a mismatch between evolution and between the way we are currently living, absolutely. And of course, that tells you a little bit about how to treat it.
Chris, I know you see a lot of very tough patients in your clinic. Do you see Alzheimer's, and do you have some concordance there with Dr. Bredesen's thoughts?
We don't treat a lot of Alzheimer's in the clinic, but we see earlier stage dementia and cognitive issues. And you know, I would just equate. There's really no modern disease that I'm aware of that doesn't have this element of mismatch at the core. You know, if you look at traditional populations, contemporary hunter-gatherers, they died because of trauma or lack of emergency medical care, of high rates of infant mortality, and so their average lifespans were shorter for those reasons, but they didn't get chronic disease, typically. Chronic disease is actually a modern problem. There just wasn't a lot of chronic disease in traditional populations, and people have argued that that's because they didn't live long enough to get it, but there have been anthropological studies that have found that when contemporary hunter-gatherer populations had access to even the most rudimentary emergency medical care, they lived lifespans that were equivalent largely to our modern lifespans, but the difference is they reached those ages without acquiring Alzheimer's disease and type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease or any of these other modern problems. So yeah, I would argue that there is really no modern disease that isn't primarily driven by this mismatch.
Akil, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just to add to the NF-kappa B, there's some really fascinating research about the effect of spices on that, on activating that transcription factor. So, you know, that's a huge part of Ayurveda, and I'm sure everybody here knows about turmeric, but also, you know, a lot of other spices that are commonly used, like allspice, clove, ginger, cinnamon, fenugreek. These have all been shown to promote NF-kappa B activity, and you know, speaking of Alzheimer's, India has one of the lowest rates, you know, in the world, and I think partly is maybe due to dietary factors and the use of spices and turmeric, and I think these are simple suggestions that we can give our patients, because no matter what kind of diet somebody's following, they can incorporate spices. Spices are the second most nutrient-dense type of food that's out there after organ meats. So in addition to nutrient density and antioxidant capacity, anti-inflammatory effects, and, you know, positive gene modulation, spices also help digestion, and they can help your food taste better. So I think there's really a win-win situation using spices.
Awesome. Steph, we're having some great feedback on your talk here on Twitter. It's always fun to watch this as it's happening. People are wondering sort of, you know, what are some of the common things? Was that case that you saw common? And what are some other things that you're doing regularly to induce, say, pregnancy and help in that part when the lab tests are showing normal?
Yeah, I think the perspective to keep in mind when you're looking at cases like that is that there's a subclinical communication to our biological system that's saying this is not a good time, this is not a great opportunity. And as opposed to looking at even, you know, relatively subnormal levels from a functional medicine perspective and trying to treat it directly with thyroid hormone medication, the idea would be instead is to look at all the reasons why the biological system is getting that message and, you know, try to undo each of those factors.
Can I follow up that with a question? I know
Yeah.
last month we had Dr. Kelly Brogan, and she said, you know, as she's gone through her practice, it started off in integrative medicine with lots of labs and lots of supplements, trying to do a lot of stuff to patients. But then as she became a little bit more, as she went through it, she'd find that it was really about getting to patients and say, hey, what's happening in your life here now? Like, what is really going on? Like, what does the next stage of your life look like? And that was such a powerful lever to really, like, see significant change. And I just wonder, like, your thoughts on that, because I know you've sort of become known as a hormone and birth specialist in that way. Yeah. It seems like having a child is a pretty big moment, and I wonder, I just thought in the context of your conversations today, I just thought I'd love to hear you comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think similar to Kelly, my practice is evolving in that way too. Where I see functional medicine more as a bridge for bringing people to this kind of perspective in order to give them a broader view or a macro level view of really what's going on in their life. How are they eating? What are their relationships like? What are they thinking about? What are they afraid of? And I think it plays a huge role to look at the 12-foot view rather than the nitty-gritty micro details of the numbers.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited to have tonight here on the stage Dr. Bredesen, Dr. Kresser, Dan Kalish is in the house. I spoke about this big convergence of doctors who are really bringing the brand of functional medicine forward and getting it out there and coming up with their own programs. Dr. Kapadia, you spoke about creating these playlists. It seems like if there are doctors out there that are bringing sort of tribes of doctors through into this new paradigm, that having a playlist of best of labs and supplements and structures, there's going to be some sort of need to to support that the reproducibility of, say, Chris's work to tens of thousands of other doctors. And how do you think IGBO can play a role in that?
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm really inspired by the work that you all are doing, because it really gets to the root cause. And as a practicing doc on the other side in traditional healthcare, I'm not seeing that happen. It's wait until it's broken, then go to the most expensive resource and get it fixed, and that's what I see over and over again. So it's refreshing. And so my goal at IGBO, and I want to shout out to Andy Grayson, our Chief Communications Officer here, and Ann McLean, who's our provider sales support, but is to really enable you guys to do the great work, all of you guys do the great work that you're doing every day, and not worry about the logistics of the blood tests that desperately need to be done. It sounds very much that lab testing appropriately can diagnose conditions that can be treated very, very early on before they become quote unquote diseases. So our idea is really to take the insights from all that you're all doing, and hopefully we'll do some of that tonight, and really start to build that framework where we can pull all this amazing science. There are certain laboratory companies that probably all use, but there's so much more that's out there that we could tap into. And so that's going to take a little bit of time, but also, as we start to learn how you practice, what you're looking for, we can start to build the compendium of amazing labs out there, reference labs, hormone testing, metal testing, nutritional type of deficiencies, and then looking at genetics and genomics and putting that all together to say what would a baseline panel for a certain digestive problem look like, or what would it look like for a baseline for a cognitive dysfunction Alzheimer's type patient, and then what would be the follow-up testing that would be required to test the effects of whether it's lifestyle behavior changes or supplements or nutritional changes in that kind of follow-up, and being able to hardwire that in some packages we've discussed before.
These guys are ready to learn, and they're ready to learn from all of you. So I would encourage you, if you have ideas about packages or different combinations of labs, find Dr. Kapadia, find these other people afterwards. We are going to have time for a few questions from the audience, but I would just remind you that if you want to be on the functional forum sometime, come and speak to me and we'll speak. This is not your moment to be on the functional forum. We got an awesome panel here. And you know how that's like at conferences, right? You know how that goes. We don't have time for that sort of nonsense, but we will take some questions from the panel. Let's go down right here. All right.
Thank you. Awesome, you guys. Thank you. If I was going to get a lab done as an everyday person and I want to look at amyloid plaque or C-reactive protein, where do I start on the first couple layers of labs that the everyday person could maybe afford and should know their numbers?
Steph and Chris, you guys are the most generalists, I would say. Why don't you jump in there? What are the most common ones you guys are using?
So I have a case review blood panel that I do with every patient that comes into my practice, and it is a fine line between doing everything you could possibly imagine doing and patients spending thousands of dollars, and then doing not enough where you don't get the information you need. So I'm always actually kind of tweaking that, but I look at blood sugar, fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C. I have patient do some post-meal blood sugar testing with the glucometer to see what their reaction to their carbohydrate tolerance. We do a comprehensive metabolic panel. We do a full thyroid panel. We do a CB. Are you a clinician? Or, oh, okay. So yeah, we complete blood count. So we look at white blood cells and red blood cells, can give us some information about your immune function. Nutrients like vitamin D and vitamin B12, which are really, you know, cornerstone nutrients. A full iron panel. You know, because iron deficiency, very common problem, but iron overload is also a problem with cognitive disorders. I'm just going by memory here, down my entire panel. Magnesium, uric acid, which can be important for blood sugar disorders, and of course a lipid panel. You know, that's kind of the basics of it, and you can get all of that for if you have insurance. You know, it will often cover it entirely, or if you're paying out of pocket, it's about $180 the way we do it. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a Kresser panel in the works for sure. Steph?
I would add to that because I see a lot of women, hormones. You know, I add hormones, but everything that Chris is looking at, I'm also looking at in addition to the hormonal factors.
Absolutely. All right, one more question here.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you guys talk about hyperthyroidism and what that means from a functional evolutionary perspective?
I mean, I'll be curious to hear what you have to say, but I don't know that it's, you know, hyperthyroidism is typically autoimmune. So what I would say about that is, from an evolutionary perspective, again, autoimmune diseases were quite rare until really recently, and they're still quite rare in the developing world. If you're familiar with the hygiene hypothesis or the old friends hypothesis, one theory is that our over-sanitized environment has reduced our exposure to organisms that we co-evolved with and had kind of a tuning effect on our immune system. And so any condition that involves an autoimmune element like hyperthyroidism, typically Graves' disease is the primary cause of hyperthyroidism, could be looked at as an expression of mismatch with our modern environment.
I mean, I think I would agree. It's just another dysregulated response by the body to, you know, environmental inputs that are not meant to be experienced, essentially. So,
Dr. Bredesen, maybe I could have you have the final word here on the panel. You know, I know one of the things that is very exciting about your work is that Alzheimer's has certainly been something that there's no treatment for, and no conventional treatment for, and some of the results that you've had coming from your practice has been really powerful. Just to speak to the sort of the potential of this convergence, right? You know, you've got Chris who's doing very deep, very sick patients, doing a lot of labs, working these things at a deep level. You also have this sort of, you know, the old school naturopathic therapeutic order, right? Where you can start, if you can placebo yourself well, then you should probably do that. And if that doesn't work, you know, maybe a bit of diet and lifestyle and then supplements. And then, you know, we've got the whole therapeutic order upside down with, you know, doing so many of the drugs. What do you see from your corner of the globe, where you're seeing, you know, tough people with no conventional treatments? What is the promise of this integrative lifestyle, functional, evolutionary medicine to make an impact on non-communicable disease?
And I should say we came from completely the other way. We came out of the test tube, and the surprise about 5-6 years ago has been that when you look at the mechanisms driving this underlying process, it fits into the functional medicine model just beautifully. You couldn't ask for a better fit. So in fact, if you look at this huge problem, we're talking about out of the 318 million Americans, 75 million who are ApoE4 heterozygotes, 7 million who are homozygotes. If you are homozygous, you have about a 90% chance of developing Alzheimer's, about 30% if you're heterozygous, and about 9% if you have 0 copies of ApoE4. So it's a huge issue. And in fact, just as you said, this is being driven largely by glycotoxicity, by essentially the way we are living. And interestingly, many of the panels we see look very much like what Dr. Daniel showed us a few minutes ago. They typically are hypothyroid. They typically have a slightly high TSH. So absolutely, the first thing starts with diet, exercise, stress, and sleep. And the surprise is how large of an effect that makes and how large of a negative effect that makes with sedentary lifestyles, high stress. So I have a chapter in a book coming up which looks at how do you give if you wanted to give yourself Alzheimer's, which presumably you wouldn't, but if you want, it's an instructive thing to think about. How would you do it? And in fact, you would basically do what we're all doing in our lifestyles. You'd have a high stress, you'd be eating all sorts of meat, you'd have a lousy diet, you'd be eating a lot of sugar and processed foods, the same foods we saw just a few minutes ago. You'd be doing many of the things that our society drives us to do. So you're absolutely right. That is the first way to go. It is a mismatch, as Chris was saying earlier. And then from there, you can go through the herbs. We have an Ayurvedic physician in the laboratory. We use very much that approach. We typically do use ashwagandha, which interestingly increases the removal of amyloid. Bacopa, very common thing to use. Curcumin, very common as well. And you just go down those. And obviously, the idea is that drugs are the dessert. Drugs are not the entree. Drugs are the dessert. So there is a place for drugs. We typically tell the patients 36 holes in the roof. A drug will help with one hole very well, but it's only one hole. You got to get the other 35 holes. And that's where functional medicine comes in.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. A big round of applause for the panel here.
Thanks so much for watching, and for more great clips like this, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. I've created a special free video just for you. It's called the 5 Steps to Becoming a Leader in Your Wellness Community, and it'll give you some of the starting points on how to position yourself as the leader in your zip code of your health community. All you have to do is click on the link below.